Let me tell you about our distinguished speaker. Professor Lila Lughod is the Joseph L. Buttonweiser Professor of Social Science at Columbia University, where she teaches anthropology and gender studies. She's a former director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, the Center for the Study of Social Difference, and the Middle East Institute, all at Columbia. A leading voice in the debates about gender, Islam, and global feminist politics. I lost my spot. Where is it? It was a good point, too. Okay, here we go. Her books and articles have been translated into 14 languages. Her scholarship, strongly ethnographic, has focused on the relationship between cultural forms and power, the politics of knowledge and representation of the Arab and Muslim worlds, and the dynamics of gender and the question of human and women's rights in the Middle East. Her award-winning books include Veiled Sentiments, Honor and Poetry in a Bedouin Society, Writing Women's Worlds, Bedouin Stories, Remaking Women, Feminism and Modernity in the Middle East, and Dreams of Nationhood, The Politics of Television in Egypt. Her most recent book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving?, was published by Harvard University Press in 2013. The title of her talk is Muslim Women and the Freedom to Choose. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lila Lughod.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was so nice. And I have the freedom to choose to change my title, I noticed. Sorry, I should have let you know. But you never know quite what you're going to do until you do it. And I realized that wasn't quite right, what I sent in a long time ago. So thank you so much all for coming, for co-sponsoring, for the lovely introduction. And this isn't the first time I've spoken at MSU, and I can't remember where I was the last time, but it was a wonderful experience. But I'm really glad to be back. So I guess I'll just start. So I called this actually Muslim Women and the Right to Choose Freely. And so I'll just start with this, that in January 2014, just as I was leaving for Egypt to go visit the village that I've been working in for the last 20 years or so, the Pew Foundation reported on an opinion survey that had been conducted by a University of Michigan researcher in various Muslim countries about what was the most appropriate form of dress for women in public and women's dress. And a majority of the you can still see, right? Yeah, a majority of respondents had selected from a set of these cartoon images, the one of a woman wearing a headscarf or hijab, and the only countries in which a majority had selected women with their hair showing were Turkey and Lebanon. So was the significance of these choices supposed to be self-evident, I asked. So the next day, a Lebanese satirist, who I love to follow, tweeted a mock version of the poll under the headline, let me try to get you that one. Yeah. An Arab university ran this fascinating poll about what is most appropriate for American women to wear in public. And the survey purported to compare the votes of people in different U.S. states for a range of images. And they had to choose from a blonde cheerleader, cowgirl, and these people in funny hats, a Statue of Liberty, and allegedly 44% selected the woman in the revealing dress whose hat was covered with dollar signs. So, the point of the satire, of course, was to expose the absurdity of this obsession with women's dress. And to sort of uncover, to use that, some of what lay behind it, which are anxieties in the West, about the hijab, Islam, various forms of covering that are linked to very deadly fantasies about freedom and choice, I think. And a graph reproduced in the same Pew report exposes this assumption perfectly. Should women be able to choose their own clothing? This is the real survey, not the mock one. It's absurd too. But the graph shows that in various Muslim majority countries, how they responded to this question. And a large proportion agreed that women should be able to choose what they wore. And if you read in the article, the findings puzzled the researchers because the idea that women should choose what they wear came not just from Tunisia, Lebanon, and Turkey, where they don't cover their hair and didn't think that was the most appropriate, but from Saudi Arabia, where they do, which are on the other end of the extreme of covering. So the majority of people had thought the most appropriate form of dress was the face veil. So the framing of the study, I think, reveals common views in Europe and the United States that veiling is somehow connected to questions of choice and freedom. The researcher sort of said these forms of dress were, for him, representative of certain values, going from the extreme of conservatism, fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, the most covered, to secularism, modernity, freedom, aligned with the last one. So the debates about banning, in Europe, about banning headscarves or face veils, which I'm sure you all know about, and last summer the to-do about the so-called burkini on French beaches, alongside general worries about Muslims and the hijab in North America that we see intensifying all around us now, all turn on this question of choice. Are Muslim women veiling out of choice, or is this form of dress a dark sign of coercion by patriarchal men, by patriarchal religions, by patriarchal authoritarian states? Should women be allowed to choose what they wear, or do states that want to protect certain values and individual freedom, secular values, or the security of others, have the right to tell women what they can and cannot wear, what they should, can they legislate what they wear? Are liberal protections of freedom of religion relevant to what women wear, or do threats of certain civilizational values, I'm full of puns, trump some groups' rights to express themselves, or some women's rights to wear whatever they want? So the value of freely choosing, which I used in my title, my new title, is enshrined in the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, as it's known, often known as the Women's Bill of Rights. And different articles guarantee women's equal rights to choose freely their professions and their partners. And these ideals rest on a confidence that we can know what a free choice is. They rest on the conviction that freedom to choose is the ultimate good. But I want to trouble today with you the idea that we can know when a choice is freely made, who gets to determine whether an act or a form of dress was freely chosen or not, and is there a pattern to whose choices are more likely to be perceived as free? So political theorists, I'm sure you know, like Nicholas Rose and Wendy Brown, have had a lot to say about choice and the heavy ideological politics of freedom. And in a wonderful analysis of secular discourse as it emerged in the heated European debates about burqas or face coverings, Wendy Brown, for example, pointed out the strange double standard at work in talk about women. We seem to have very tolerant views of Western women's desires for debilitating shoes, expensive clothes, cosmetics, costly plastic surgery, while we have intolerant views of Muslim women's clothing. The former understood as, of course, arising from individual women's free choice. And she comments, and this is a long quote, apologies, I won't do this again, but we need Wendy Brown, political theorist, here. It's such a brilliant article. So, quote, "To sustain the conviction that Western women choose their attire while Islamic women are coerced into theirs requires ignoring, one, how conditions of choice are organized and how choice itself is normatively produced. Two, how subjects can be dominated through choice, a concern that stretches from Plato to Mill, Marcuse to Foucault. And three, how subjects can choose against their freedom or equality, an argument for which we can draw on Hobbes, Dostoevsky, Freud, and not only the Marquis de Sade. And four, above all, the idea that Western women choose while Islamic women are coerced ignores the extent to which all choice is conditioned by, as well as imbricated with power, and the extent to which choice itself is an impoverished account of freedom, especially political freedom." So I'm an anthropologist. I'm not a political theorist, so that's the last you'll hear of political theory. And so I want to look instead at the everyday lives of to evaluate the adequacy of our everyday assumptions about choice and this valuation of choice. And I'm going to ask you to think with me whether the loaded terms of debate in public talk about Muslim women make sense when we try to understand particular women's lives in a particular community, in a particular part of the Muslim world, and even just in relation to two very charged matters, not just veiling, but which I've talked about a little bit so far, but also marriage, a second important area in which the ideal of freely choosing in CEDAW has been established as an international women's right or norm. And I'm sure you're all, probably most of you, are aware of a kind of huge moral panic that's going on these days and in the industry of international intervention and development, sort of over the last decade around the girl, the child marriage, forced marriage. So I want to sort of ask you and help me think about this. Given that we all live embedded in socially and historically specific conditions and circumstances, what does it mean to actually freely choose? Can freely choosing be the basis of judgments of relative value of different rights, different civilizations? So let's go to this village in Upper Egypt that is where I've been working for the last couple of decades. And the big news when I went back, just after seeing that Pew poll about appropriate forms of women's dress, the big news in the village when I went back right after that was, among the women and the girls, was not that survey, because they didn't know about the survey and would have laughed too. They hadn't heard about it, but they wanted to talk about a lot of big changes that were going on in Egypt and in the village, about the political situation, how it had changed since the hopeful early days of the revolution in 2011, that it succeeded in removing the longtime president, not knowing it was going to be worse. But I noticed that women were all busy talking with each other, preparing themselves for the upcoming referendum on the new constitution. There was very high turnout for voting, even though the main concerns they had as people living in this village, as women, as girls, was about the economic situation and the kind of disastrous decline in tourism. And this is an area that depends heavily on tourism, so there's none. There's none. Everybody's too scared to go. So that means nobody has jobs. They were really struggling. So that's what they were really concerned about, the referendum, the economic situation, and so forth. But they also wanted to talk about changes in the personal and everyday worlds that we had shared over the years. And in particular, they wanted to talk about the many weddings that had taken place since my last visit. And most of the newly married couples were of this younger generation, those who'd been the playmates of my children when we first went to the village. So these are the kids that... Oh, so here's a picture of the village, or a beautiful part of just outside the village. And here's my kids when we first... Well, they actually went when they were 3 months old, but this was one of the many times we lived there. So these were their friends who are now, my kids are 24, they were now getting married. So it was their weddings. So we'd known them all their lives. So I was treated to the tours of the new couples' homes that were, and they had these display cases. I'm sure some of you know about it, brimming with full sets of china, knickknacks, glassware, bonbon trays. There's a kind of regulation stuff every bride has to have, and they all had it. And so, you had to look at it. It'll never be touched for 50 years. It's going to sit just like that, but you have to have it. And their parents had worked incredibly hard to save up for all this stuff. They had borrowed money so that they could buy the washing machine, the fridge, everything that they would need for their lives together as a couple, and including the kind of teddy bears that were sitting on the beds of the hope in the children's room that they were hoping to fill. So they had these kitchens, immaculate kitchens, complete with fridges and stoves, but barely touched because for many years a young couple will eat with the parents anyway in the main household. So they had these lovely kitchens and then went to eat with the parents. So that's for the first few years of married life. And then the bride would produce this wedding album, shyly but proudly. And these were all professionally done in the studio on the wedding day and considered, let me move ahead. Oh, that's my daughter with her best friend there later. Oh, here's one of the young couples. So we know, I saw her born. I didn't see him born. He was sort of 2 years here. He might have been, his brother was in the other picture. Anyway, so, but dressed up for their engagement picture, that was. So here, so it doesn't come out that well, but this is the kind of albums they have. So large format photos, husband and wife, groom and bride, sometimes leaning on shoulder, the couple, side by side in the background, in their rented outfits. He has a rented suit, she has a rented wedding dress. These portraits make the most, you can't actually recognize any of the girls because of the makeup, but it's the obligatory makeup and the sequins, and you can see all of this. And they're all variations on a theme, sometimes Starry Night, sometimes local scenes, sometimes European scenes. And some of the couples that I knew hadn't known each other really much before they married, and some had known each other all their lives, and but it was a generic form, so you don't know if these people actually, this is the first time they touched or they were, loved each other. But all this is erased in the albums because this is the standard form. So let me come back to the issue of dress, which you see here. So it was interesting that several of the women remarked, as we looked at the photos, and there were many different kinds of photos of weddings, on the decision of some women to cover their hair. And I could see that they, here, she wears a bridal veil, but under it is a kind of modified hijab, and some more so. But some didn't cover their hair, and they had spaghetti strap wedding gowns, but she has the body, as it's called, the like spandex long sleeve thing that you wear under the revealing clothes. So there were lots of variations. Some had elaborate hairdos, some covered their hair like this. And I was kind of surprised to see some of the ones with their hair uncovered and the spaghetti straps, because this is normally people do cover their hair and wear modest clothing just as ordinary stuff, even though it can be fashionable in blue jeans and tunic tops and things like that, but it's still modest. But as people always explained to me when we looked at these photos, and especially when I would kind of notice the ones in the spaghetti strap with the big hair, they would say, it's a bride chooses what she wants to wear. It's her day. So they put it on the bride, you can wear whatever you want on this day. Now, this emphasis on choice was striking to me, since I think about choice. Concerns about freedom and choice lurk behind that survey of public dress, just as they haunt every debate in Europe about that piece of clothing that seems to be more important to politicians and to feminists than the desires and self-understandings of the women who wear it. And protection of Muslim women's rights has been promoted in the name of choice. Women who cover themselves, as I said, are often thought to be coerced into it, even though it's not mandatory, except in a few countries, in public. And it's also more the case that many young women have had to fight their families in order to wear the hijab, in order to wear covering forms of dress, and most of their mothers didn't. So, the choice is going sort of the other way. So Leila Ahmed has called this a quiet revolution, to take on the hijab, to do these new forms of piety, based on a long controversy over the meanings of the veil. So, I'm asking myself, why? How did forms of dress become signs of freedom or constraint, especially when we know how hard it is to distinguish dress that is freely chosen from that which is worn out of habit, out of social pressure, or the imperatives of the fashion industry, including a now flourishing Islamic fashion industry, which is very, runways and amazing clothes. So, is that choice? Too, that's also limited and coerced in certain ways. And I love this cover of the New Yorker once, it's like, and the heading, the caption is "Girls Will Be Girls." And you're like, you can look at this for hours and think like, what does it mean? Girls are, who's coerced, who's choosing, what does it mean? I don't know if the cartoonist thought the way I do, but I like it. Anyway, so the fear of Muslims that motivates this strange reversal in which forms of undress have been legislated in the name of freeing women, I think has been exposed brilliantly in the writing of a lot of people, including Joan Scott and Martha Nussbaum even, who I don't always agree with, but she came around on this one. And these dress policies and the sort of underlying assumptions about choice have also been opposed by Muslim women. And particularly, I like the ones who orchestrated something called Muslima Pride Day. I don't know if any of you took part in it. A few years ago, spring of 2013, and this was in response to the topless jihad, as it's called, by a feminist group called Femen, who do these protests, burn Salafi flags in front of mosques, topless. And they have things across their chests that say freedom for women, and so forth. So the signs of, something's happened here. Are we okay? The signs held by the young women who posted their photos on Muslima Pride Day in response to this kind of thing say a lot of things, like her, who says, nudity does not liberate me and I do not need saving. And from all around the world, women posted pictures of themselves looking different ways, my religion is my choice, that kind of thing. And freedom of choice. So I don't have a picture of that. So again, how does choice emerge as the test of a good life, the marker of women's status, when it's actually such a complicated concept? And it seems to me when we get to this obsession with choice, it's clear that we've entered not just the realm of ideology, but of fantasy. So this is one of the themes of my book. Do Muslim women need saving, that you kindly mentioned. And what had provoked my curiosity had been the way that choice was deployed as a key symbol in the new culture wars that pitted the freedoms of the liberated West against the oppression suffered by the Muslim woman. If we want to take Miriam Cook's wonderful phrase, it's like one word, the Muslim woman, right? The generic Muslim woman, as opposed to the free Western one. And it has justified everything from invasions of Afghanistan, which we were talking about earlier, military invasions, immigrant policing, and border control. And of course, we're living with that now in a very big way. So the focus on choice in the matter of Muslim women's rights, I argued in this book, has a double genealogy. On the one hand, it's kind of reputable. It comes out of CEDAW, it comes out of human rights, it comes out of feminism, with their utopian and universalist ideals. But the second basis for this that allows it, I think, to have such purchase is more sordid. And I wrote about, and I think we can track it through the history of popular representations that are today represented by what Dora Ahmed has called, she's a literary scholar, called pulp nonfiction. And I wrote about this. The heroines of this genre are oppressed Muslim women who've escaped abuse. Both feminist human rights and sordid pulp nonfiction, I think, work together to establish distinction and to rank cultures and societies in some kind of civilizational scale whose coordinates are marked by freedom versus bondage, consent versus force, choice versus constraint. And so I think you probably all know the story from the universalist, feminist, CEDAW ideals, which are good, and that's where freely chosen lives comes from. And the West is, in some theorists' views, still patriarchal, but way ahead of other cultures where they're way behind. And I think the fiction that any of us choose freely, and I'm going to come back to this again and again, is maintained by conjuring up, whether explicitly as in these novels, or implicitly those in distant lands who live in bondage with no rights, no choice, no agency. And the fact that in liberal democracies, which I guess we have still, the most contentious debates are about how choice should be balanced with the public good in schooling, in healthcare, in welfare, reproduction, gun control. This gets lost in the storyline of those others who have no choice. So I looked in this book, I'm an anthropologist, but I looked in the book at a genre that makes the storyline, I think, very believable for a lot of people around the US. And apparently these are popular in Europe too. So these are popular mass market memoirs that form the seedy bedrock for these lofty universalist aspirations. So books like this, Without Mercy, you've all seen them at airport bookstores. Probably you've all read them, some of them. The copycat covers always show women hidden by black veils, sometimes white, some revealing only the eyes, sometimes only one eye, depends on the part of the world. I think the Bangladeshi one, they have one, the South Asian ones, but they're called Sold, One Woman's True Account of Modern Slavery, My Forbidden Face, Without Mercy, this one, Burned Alive, Married by Force, which I showed you earlier, the picture of. And these are always personal stories as told to someone. And it's hard to know whether to treat these memoirs as nonfiction or not. They're billed as nonfiction. And some are unreliable, people have pointed out, because they rely on repressed memories, like suddenly somebody remembers all this terrible stuff that happened to her, but she'd forgotten it for 25 years, or, some of these are very interesting. Many of the protagonists are known only by first names, or they're secret. Those princesses, or whatever she's called, the princess, what are they called? Anyway, the Saudi princesses. Some are based on, some like Norma Khouri's Honor Lost, have been exposed as complete fakes, frauds, hoaxes. And the books are always co-written with journalists or with ghostwriters. And one of the ghostwriters I read about in an English newspaper had written like 100 of these. So it's a genre. And their names never appear, right, the ghostwriters. So anyway, to the extent that they might reflect real bad experiences, incidents, which is possible, I think they're as disturbing as any stories that we read about in the paper, that we know about among our friends, stories of abuse that we know happen everywhere. Psychology case studies, pathological behavior everywhere. So there may be some of that. But the books work very hard not to let you make that comparison. So they're very exotic. They set them in basements and Pakistani homes in the north of England. They set them in Morocco. They set them in the hills of Yemen, so that it's this exotic locale that is very different from anything that we know. And because they're personal stories, as told to, they never have to ask what the community thought of the particular marriage or the abuse that you're hearing about. So you don't know whether the community itself condemns this just as much as we all condemn any of these stories that we hear about. So, but they never let you know that, because they never put it in a context. They only put it in the context of an exotic culture, but not actually a community of people who might really disapprove of this and think it's immoral and think it's, many things that horrifying as we would think. So, and Letty Bolt, this legal scholar, has called this, blaming culture for bad behavior. So it's the culture that makes this happen. And what I argue in the book is that these stories work at the affective level, emotional level, to connect readers to the ideals of freedom and choice that are being so violated in these stories. Of our victims or heroines. And then by associating them with these other cultures, and most times they are Muslim cultures, then the affect goes, you love the heroine, you hate the culture and the religion that is making her life so miserable. So, and I think the messages of these tawdry, as I call them, tawdry memoirs are reinforced by much more respectable work that we all hear about by feminist figures, celebrated in Western social circles, especially those forged by Islamophobia, that I think now are moving very much into the White House, in fact. So we have, I don't know if she's come out yet, apparently not yet. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose first book was called The Caged Virgin, An Emancipation Proclamation for Women and Islam, bondage, freedom, consent. And then there's this, my favorite person, this 70-year-old American feminist psychologist, Phyllis Tesslar, who recently published a memoir of her 6 months, as she calls it, in captivity in Kabul, back to Kabul, as the young bride of an elite, very elite Afghani fellow student from Bard College that she met when she was 19. She married him, very exotic. She was really excited, girl from Brooklyn. And she goes to Afghanistan, and his dad, I think, was the head of the major bank there. So they were in a gated community with chauffeurs and embassy parties and blah, blah, blah. But she saw it was captivity. And when she escaped after 6 months, and her chapter titles of this memoir that she just came up with talk about kind of Muslim bondage to American freedom. The chapter titles go, I didn't copy them out, The Imprisoned Bride, then Burqas, then Harem Days, then Trapped, then finally Escape. And she calls burqas body bags. So, anyway, I could tell you a lot more about her, but I'll keep going. So, but these are the sort of respectable people, not the trashy novels, who are saying the same thing, basically. So when the ideologically loaded categories of choice and consent are applied to non-Western women's lives in this way, they stigmatize the groups, and they help rationalize intervention. And I think we have to think harder about choice, and this is one of the ways we can sort of cut into this problem. And here I want to go back to marriage. I showed you wedding albums. So this is an important event in the lives of most, and particularly for those back to Egypt, those village brides who so eagerly shared their wedding albums with me. And in the community in Upper Egypt, that I've been telling you about, and across the Middle East, and the Muslim world, actually. Middle East, village, let's stick with that. I'll come back to the Muslim world. Family is very important. Mutuality, relationality, mutual concern, these are as highly valued as, I would say, individualism. Gender is closely tied to familial power, and everybody recognizes that, but it's true for both men and for women. And liberal dreams like the choice of marital partner and equality in marriage, or what women should enjoy in marriage and family relations as promoted in CEDAW, it takes on a different valence. And I think when we look at their lives, it helps us understand a little bit more about how the complexity of human lives that are always formed in social worlds for everyone, everywhere, confound this ideal of choosing freely. So I'm going to go to that. Whoops. Oh, that's the village. Okay, here's my little friend. So I want to give you 2 examples of what I mean. So in rural Egypt, as elsewhere, there's been a very intriguing phenomenon that's developed over the past 20 years or so. Girls and young women have been developing knowledge of their rights under Islamic law. And they have been using this knowledge to challenge some of the customary arrangements for marriage and many other things by pointing to the requirement of consent, which is built into Islamic marriage. Parallel efforts have been underway across the Muslim world by feminist reformers of various sorts, from secular to Islamic or Islamist, to make choice, consent, and contract the instruments for guaranteeing women's rights in marriage. And Musawa is one of the big organizations of kind of global movement for reform from within Muslim family law. But again, although the village girls and Muslim feminists both invoke the importance of consent, and all the families that I know in the village, at least, and elsewhere, insist on the importance of a young woman's consent to marriage, the dilemmas that young women face in trying to make their decisions about whether they should marry someone or not are, I think, as tough as everyone else's or who your partner is going to be. Let's not put it in marriage, but it's not that easy to figure out if this is the right person, if this is how you want to have your life. Is this the right person to marry? And I think the things that go into their decisions are just as complicated as the things that go into ours. What do we think about when we think about who we want to be with? We love them, of course, but character, compatibility, looks, money, class, family background, religion, ethnicity, there's so many things that go in, personality, pheromones, who knows why we choose who we choose. But it's complicated, and you don't actually know if it's going to be the right choice, and for many people it isn't, as we know. So what does it mean to choose a partner, freely choose a partner? I think this is a tough question, and it's a question that sort of cracks open the ideological nature of the link between that survey that I opened with, between status, rights, and choice, that they presumed were there in these unfamiliar forms of dress. So some are choosing, some are being coerced. It's so much more complicated than that. So, but it also opens up I said something about fantasy, and maybe we use the word phantasmic element of the ideal of choice. And this is something that Judy Butler, who I'm sure many of you know, feminist philosopher, queer philosopher, she wrote this amazing essay on sexual consent. What does that mean? And she goes beyond the usual legal arguments about, legal consent. Did you sign a paper? Did you say yes? Did you mean yes? That kind of thing. By noting how consent might not be just a core liberal value, but actually part of a strong fantasy that we have of autonomy. And that would explain a little bit about why we're so attached to this idea. And she reminds us that we shouldn't forget the importance of power in determining choices. But she also asks us to reflect on how, in matters of personal desire or intimacy, consent might not have much real meaning, because we can never know, she says, what we're consenting to when we say yes. If we knew how bad it was going to be later, we wouldn't have said yes, but we don't know. At the time we consent to this, but we didn't consent to all the things that came out of being with that person, making that choice, and so forth. We can never know what we're consenting to, she says, when we say yes. And what will a choice now mean for us in the future? We actually never know. No one can predict what a choice will mean over time for individuals, even if freely chosen. So that's an interesting angle on things. And what I like so much about her essay, I'm sure some of you have read it, is that she offers this kind of poignant truth about the limits we all face as human beings. The most basic fact of our existence is that we were born into and we depend on families that we didn't choose. Choose. I'm sure many of us wish we could have chosen our families, but we didn't, right? And we spent how many years, all our lives, dependent on them. This universal, she says, joins us all together, and it mocks the concocted divide that something like burqa bans and other condemnations that Muslim women create between those who freely choose and those who don't, those who have rights, those who don't, those who are controlled by their cultures and religions, and those who determine their own lives. And so, to reduce the lives of women to a question of freely choosing doesn't actually make that much sense. On a theoretical level, it ignores basic insights of people like Foucault and about all ways that we are made as subjects and are subject to power, the social processes he calls subjectivation, and it ignores critiques like those of Saba Mahmoud, who works on Egyptian women in the piety movement, who says, why can't you recognize agency when people are choosing conformity? Why is that less agentic than choosing transgression? Interesting, but feminists always choose transgression. So, and liberals too. So, but on an ethnographic level, I find the concept of freely choosing hard to grasp because of what I've come to know about the lives of, how are we doing? Good? Hard to grasp because of what I have come to know about the lives and the sources of suffering of the women in this village that I've been so privileged to, be going to for 20 years. So I will use them, to kind of open this up a little bit. So, what do I have here? Okay. So let me take you back to the village for the second illustration. So I talked about marriage, but the way choice doesn't do justice to real lives. And I want to show you also how hard it is to shake off prejudices about patriarchal constraints against Muslim women, even for people like me. How little, but mainly how little the ideal of freely choosing captures about how people live their lives. So I was really happy when I heard the surprising news when I went back that my friend Yamna, I'll just call her Yamna, had married. And she was in her early 40s. She was not one of the young ones who grew up with my kids. And it's late in this society. It's late in a lot of societies. But a marriage proposal had come out of the blue. And when I first met her in the 1980s, late 1990s, excuse me. How old am I? No, late 1990s. She was living with her mother, who had health problems and was in and out of the hospital. Later, I found out more about her mother and the kind of troubled history that she had of what Yamna now defines as mental illness, but at the time it was understood as possession and by saints and because of a childhood trauma. But anyway, I'll come back to that. Yamna's mother had been very beautiful as this young woman, but who had this kind of trouble. And so she'd had many suitors. A lot of guys wanted to marry her, and the guys' mothers all said, no, you cannot marry this girl. She's trouble. So finally, his mother, her mother agreed with her sister, who had a son, that he should marry Yamna's mother to kind of protect her and take care of her. So he didn't really have much choice about his marriage. She was this troubled person. She married him, and things were actually fine for a while, and then he took her to there was actually a mental hospital in Aswan, and he had her treated, probably electroshock, I don't know what treatments were like in those days, and she was better. And then they had 3 kids, and he had a job, nice job, and then he got moved to Cairo with her. So, but then something went wrong. So things seemed fine. Let me see. So they went to Cairo. His job took him to Cairo, so they were living there, and then he was sent to Iraq with his company, and then came back. And as Yamna, her daughter, told the story, this was when things fell apart. Her older brother got in with a bad crowd while his dad was away, and at age 9, Yamna got her first glimpse of her mother's special state. So as she tells the story, she said it was a Friday and the radio was on in the house. Sheikh Muhammad al-Kahlawi was talking about love of the Prophet and began to sing religious songs, Yamdah. Something happened. Perhaps she remembered she started reciting God's name, Tizkar. This was the first time I'd seen anything like this, and I was afraid, because he was just reciting God's name. I was terrified. I ran running to the neighbor in the building, and the neighbor came with me, but she was somebody who didn't pray. She wasn't pious. And so the first thing my mother did was you don't pray, and threw her against the wall and shouted at her for not praying. It's Friday. So Yamna then goes on, I didn't know what was going on. I was afraid. My father came home from Friday prayers and told me, don't be afraid, but you should pray regularly. Then she won't hit you. And she said, I was only 9 years old, and I started praying. And then this is what I witnessed, she says. My mom started running off to visit saints' tombs all over Cairo. She would leave us alone, my brother, my sister, and me, and head off for these visits, religious visits to saints' tombs, which is something people do. And she always came back, but then one day she didn't come back. She took my sister and she disappeared. And then, father's going off looking for her all over the country. He looked everywhere, and eventually he went to see the Sufi sheikh, who is has a big center in the village where they're from. And he went to him and said, I don't know where my wife is. And the sheikh told him, don't be afraid for her. God's people are with her. They will take care of her. So eventually they did find her, but Yamna stayed in Cairo, and she learned so she didn't have her sister anymore, but she learned to cook. age 9, and clean and care for her father and her brother. And her father wanted her to stay in school, but she had so much housework and all this stuff, and some teachers were really mean to her and yelled at her because she didn't do her homework, so she dropped out of school. She gave up. And eventually they found her mother, and she returned, but she couldn't handle living in Cairo, and so she wanted to go back to the village and take the 2 girls with her. And this was the point at which Yamna made a choice. She and her sister chose for themselves to stay with their father. So, which is kind of unusual thing to do too in Cairo, and it was very tough for them living in Cairo. 2 young girls with the father who was off at work all day. Was a kind of awkward life for them. No mother, they're taking care of him. And it turned out their father was often ill. He was in and out of the hospital. He had asthma. He had all kinds of medical issues. But then came what Yamna had certainly not chosen or wanted, and she says, I remember it as if it was yesterday. It was a Thursday. He was late coming home from work. Then someone from his company came to the door, and he told my sister, your father's a little unwell. So we took him to the hospital. And Yamna continues, so they rushed to the hospital, and we found him on an oxygen machine with a drip. What, Baba, are you okay? And he says, no, it's just my asthma. I said, should I get in touch with the family, and get Mom and the auntie to come? And he said, no, don't bother. I'll be out, soon. Go home. I'll be fine. And they stayed with him till the evening, and scary to come home on their own to the apartment. But anyway, so on Friday, the next day, she brought her sister. They went and said, shouldn't we get in touch with family members? These are like 2 girls. Shouldn't someone stay with us? He said, no, I'm fine. I'll be home in a couple of days. And then, fine. And that was Friday, and Saturday he was dead. So somebody came, and they didn't even know whether to tell her. So she wailed in the streets. The neighbors all came. The cousins, the uncles, everybody came from the village to get the body, took the corpse home, took the girls home to the village and where her mother was, and that was it. But she says, they were kind to us, but no one can take the place of a father. We drove straight from the hospital all the way home and crying all the way. And it's like probably 18 hours. I don't know, it's a long drive from Cairo to Luxor. So after that, she carried even heavier responsibilities when she lived with her mother and brother, who himself had some problems, and she was totally devoted to her little sister and made sure she finished school, went to Mahed, a more advanced degree. She was really just devoted to making sure her sister at least got this education, and she took care of her asthmatic and troubled mother, who had a lot of problems, and then later she had to take care of an aunt who had a stroke. This was a tough life for her. But then out of the blue, this marriage proposal came, right? So she agreed. And her new husband was older, divorced, and she was open to it because she said, she'd been led to understand that he was a serious person, and he had a reputation as an upright man, so, he wasn't like playing with her, and also a religious healer of sorts. And he looked up to and sort of followed the same Sufi religious family that her family followed. So there she is. So when I went to see her in her new home, just like the young brides that I'd been visiting to congratulate, she showed me her display, a case full of glass and china and baubles, but it was much more modest, and she didn't have any family to help her save up for it, but she had it. And then she pulled out her wedding album to show me, and it was this kind of faux blue suede thing with these hearts on it, and here was a page of it, and it had 6 magnificent color photos, like everybody else, studio photos of her and her new husband, and the scenes were generic. I think they have a Luxor scene behind here, and the only difference is, she's covering her hair, a little bit of hair showing, very interesting, and her husband is not wearing a rented suit, but traditional galabiya, dignified one. So I wasn't surprised to see that she didn't have her hair out, and this was the difference, was really his clothes. But there was something different about her album, which was she opened it to the front, And she had inserted a black and white photo that I'd seen before at home, a studio portrait, and it was of her father. So she brought it with her, who she loved so much, who she lost so young. And her attachment with family was still very strong. She was married, but she was bringing her father into this with her. The romance of marriage is great, but you know, you're a bigger person than that. You have bigger ties than that. So it wasn't being displaced by this new marriage. So after I admired the album, she pulled out some folders to show me. And these were medical results from fertility tests. And they were in English because all medical exams and tests are in English in Egypt, so very helpful for people. So I studied them, you know, and read through them, and I'm no doctor, so I didn't really know what I was understanding, you know, but I understood enough, and I sort of studied them quietly and sort of said, you know, because they were terrible. I mean, it was clear she was never going to get pregnant. But I didn't say much, you know, I said, inshallah, you know. But I left the visit pretty worried because I thought, you know, when you marry, you're supposed to have kids. In Egypt, not so much here. Oops, back. Well, I'll leave that one. So I talked with friends about my visit with Yamna, and they were happy for her, as was I, you know, a little bit nervous. They all said, you know, she sacrificed so much for other people. It's great now that she gets something for herself. But they all thought she was too old to conceive. And even in the, you know, fancy New York IVF clinics, you know, 40 is, in your 40s is pushing it. They don't like you because their odds are really, really bad. So I realized I was sort of secretly worried that her marriage wouldn't last because she wasn't going to produce kids for this marriage. And when I said this to another friend, she said, but he already has children. He was divorced, he had kids. It's she who hasn't. And she was sort of very sympathetic about these medical tests, and she said it's for her sake that he's paying all this money for her to get these medical exams. You know, it's expensive to get tests, as you all know, and it's expensive there. And it's for her sake that he's taking her to all these doctors to see. So it was kind of his kindness, not what I realized, you know, I had this assumption that, you know, if you get married, you know, wives will be divorced if they don't produce the kids. There's a lot of pressure on brides. But similarly to husbands, if he's impotent or can't conceive, it's a woman's right to divorce him because children are really important. But I knew lots of childless couples who stayed together even though they could have divorced each other because he wanted children. But I realized I had this in the back of my mind, this kind of patriarchal thing that they only want to get married in order to have kids, and if the wife doesn't produce, then off she goes. Or you take a second wife. You know, that's one of the grounds on which you can. So it was this weird thing. So I had to stop, you know, and say, I hadn't thought about what she wanted, right? What she wanted was to have kids, to have a life that other women had. And kids are very important, and they're wonderful. And so, you know, I understand that. But I hadn't thought about what she wanted. And she'd mumbled something about IVF. And, you know, I know how prohibitively expensive, you know, this is really like way out of her range. She can barely, you know, they're barely getting by. So she wasn't going to have IVF. She wasn't going to have choice in this matter that was so important to her. So the odds were stacked against her. She wouldn't be able to freely choose to have children, freely choose how many children to have. And I think this lack of choice in the most important and kind of intimate sphere of her life, it had absolutely nothing to do with whether she wore the hijab or not. This is like deep choice, deep life in the wedding. So this brings me just to the final point, or kind of maybe a twist, if I have time. Do I have a few minutes? A last twist in the story, in the stories that I've been telling you about choice. So for Yamna, faith was incredibly important to her. At the end of the story that she told about her father and what happened to her in Cairo and her father's death, she'd said to me, when one has faith in God, it gives one strength. Without my faith in God, I could never have handled my mother's illness, my father's death, and the horrible situation we found ourselves in. Unquote. So I'm going to come back to that. So we're Yamna still in the village. She's not very far from the village where her mom is. had she stayed in the village, in this little hamlet where we always are, where she'd been since she was 17, she would probably be among the women that I saw on my last visit who were going to the mosque to pray. And this was the big news of 2015 when I went to visit the next time. So with the collapse of foreign tourism, absolute collapse, no foreigners there, no Italians, no Russians, even Russians used to come. Even the Russians, like nobody was coming. So with the collapse after the revolution, the only visitors to the Pharaonic temple that's in the village where she lives, that had busloads and busloads and busloads of tourists. They get their half hour at this temple, then they get, if any of you have been to Egypt, you know what that's like. The only ones who now visit are some domestic tourists, Egyptians from the cities who come to see this heritage. And some of the women, the Egyptian women who came to see didn't see it. There it is. You're wondering what I'm talking about as I'm pointing, because both of them are on the screen. So a lot of the women who came, especially during Ramadan and things like that, had complained that there was no place to pray privately in the village when they got off the bus and went to the tour. And most people pray at home, so it's never been an issue in the village, and the men do pray in the mosque. They have a teeny little mosque. They pray on Friday prayers, but most men pray at home too. So nobody, it wasn't a big issue, and wasn't an issue at all for women. But these tourists, they have nowhere private to go to pray, and they wanted something. So the village all collected money and built a second floor on their mosque for women, so that these women could have some place private to pray. And then the local women all started going, and they liked it, and they liked going to the Friday prayer and hearing the sermon, like their husbands and their sons and their brothers and so forth. Not all of them went, but they liked it. You'd dress up and go, and for sure Yamina would have been one of those people because she was pious, and it was right next door to her house. So I thought, okay, so is there any reason that this choice, like the choices, very much like the choices asserted by the women carrying signs on Muslima Pride Day that said, it's my choice to dress this way, it's my choice not to be nude, it's my choice to practice my religion, is this of any less value than the largely secular and liberal choices that are enshrined in CEDAW that I talked about, to freely choose partner, freely choose profession, freely choose this, or the same choices that are glorified in this pulp nonfiction about the escape from bondage of girls from their families, from their traditions, from their religion, and that's what's glorified in those novels I told you about. And all of these choices are produced within specific configurations of power, cultures that value certain things above other things, and to which women are subjected, and they're born into, or they choose these cultures. They're part of social worlds that have certain values, and through which they become subjects of their own lives. And I think we forget this at our peril, that people choose within sets of values, within communities, and we forget this at our peril and at the peril of the covered Muslim women who've become these kinds of objects of either pity, criticism, intervention, and increasingly, I think, fear. We need to keep asking hard questions about why some like to deploy and others have to defend themselves in terms of what Wendy Brown called this impoverished language of choice. And it seems to me we can do better than that. Thank you.